It is more than a great honor for me to be invited to this international seminar and be given the floor to present a short introductory paper. Thus, my first words are profound gratitude to all those who organized this seminar and invited me. And I thank all those who made the arrangements that this international seminar can take place in this wonderful city of Rabat in Morocco. As you know from the program, I'm invited to speak about the evolution of knowledge of the Quran through translations. So don't expect an overview over the history of the study of Quranic studies and its rational approach, but rather on the history of translation of the Quran and make its content known in other languages. In my first part, I would like to introduce you briefly into a significant difference between Eastern and Western, so to say, translations of the Quran and the studies behind them. And in the second part, my major part, so to say, I would like to draw your attention to a chapter that, at least in Western scholarship, is not much known. That is a translation and reception of the Quran in Eastern Europe. Speaking about Quran in the West and Quranic studies in Europe means to speak about the reception, place and role, as well as significance of the Quran in non-Muslim, predominantly Christian world, and the studies on the Holy Book of Islam as carried out primarily by non-Muslims. Usually this world is called the Christian West or Occident, in opposite to the Muslim or Islamic East or Orient. In terms of geography, we are speaking of that part of the world that by and large once belonged to the East and West Roman empires and culturally and religiously was shaped first by the legacy of the classical Greek and Latin antiquity and subsequently by the emerging Greek Orthodox and Latin Christianities and later by Judaism and Islam as well. Particularly, the contribution of Islam to the shaping of Europe should be rediscovered these days, even more important than yesterday. When it comes to the knowledge of Islam in general and of the Quran and its studies in particular, a significant difference can be observed between the Greek, Eastern Orthodox part of the West and the Latin Catholic counterpart. As noted already by Angeliki Ziyaka in her book La Recherche Grecque Contemporaine et l'Islam. For otherwise than in Latin West, Greek, Byzantine, Eastern Orthodox theologians and philosophers started to engage in various forms of theological philosophical discourse with Islam as early as in the 7th and 8th centuries. And it's almost an irony that by doing this, these theologians and philosophers became the first ones to bear witness to the emergent new religion and its holy book. In their argument with Islam, discussing passages of its holy book, they confirmed at the same time that this holy book exists. And they were able to do so because not only a few of them lived and worked in Arabic-speaking environments and thus were familiar with the language of Islam and mastered it, like, for instance, the well-known Greek theologian and father of Orthodox Christian dogmatics, Johannes of Damascus, Johanna or Yahya ad-Dimashqi, to mention just but one, who at the turn of the 7th to the 8th century worked as an official at the Umayyad court, as you may know, in Damascus, before he left the office and retreated to the monastery Marsaba. In his book about heresies, in the last chapter, Johannes deals quite extensively with the heresy of the Ishmaelites and provides, by the way, its first systematic refutation. Throughout this chapter, he quotes various Quranic ayat in his own Greek translation, thus proving that the Quran exists and giving his readers an idea of its character, and sometimes even in a distorted way, intentionally done so. And Johannes was not the only one to do that, as Adel Theodor Khoury already has worked out in his book Les théologiens byzantins et Islam. Of course, reading the tractates of these Byzantine theologians, one cannot and should not overlook that their studies of the Quran as well as their argument with Islam in general were not meant to provide a deeper understanding of the other religion, let alone rapprochement to it. Their efforts were rather guided by the attempt to find and develop ways of silencing the other by questioning and refuting the veracity of the tenets of the other's religion, and eventually repudiating it. And this one started apologetic polemical approach to and argument with Islam prevailed in their debates over centuries, even though, as Angeliki Ziaka rightly observed, there were sometimes voices raised among the Byzantine theologians that not only advocated, but also largely contributed to a more peaceful, conciliatory theological discourse with people of the other religion. Without going into further detail, just a brief look at the Latin West. For here, despite the century of living together of Muslims, Christians, and Jews under Muslim and Christian rule, for instance, in Andalusia, Quranic studies among Latin-speaking Christians started not earlier than the beginning of the 12th century, as Thomas Bormann had pointed out in his illuminating book, Reading the Quran in the Latin Christendom. Of course, these were theologians and theologians and philosophers in the Latin West also, well before the 12th century, who were writing about Islam and the Quran. However, what they wrote was not the outcome of genuine Quranic studies, but rather transmission of second-hand information from hearsay, following more or less the apologetic polemical approach known and adopted from their Byzantine Orthodox colleagues, as for instance Beatus de Liébana in the 10th century did. For further details, allow me to refer you to the nowadays almost opus classicum of Norman Daniel, Islam and the West. When it comes to the study of the Arabic Quran in the Latin West, it was the well-known Jewish convert to Christianity, Petrus Alfonsi, doesn't work, sorry, somehow it doesn't work. No. It was the Jewish convert to Christianity, Petrus Alfonsi, who was the first one to offer the readers Quranic text translated into Latin from the Arabic original. Before his conversion, in addition to his Jewish education, Petrus, born Moshe Halevi Sfaradi of Huesca, physician, astronomer, and astrologer by profession, had acquired profound knowledge of Arabic and was well versed in Arabic sciences and in Oriental literature. And he compiled also a book of exempla and fabula, as he told them, stories of Arabic, Persian, and Indian origin that was widely spread and used throughout the late Middle Ages. Like many other converts, right after his conversion, Petrus wrote an apologetic polemical tractate under the title Dialogi contra Judeos, Dialogues Against the Jews, a fictitious dialogues with Moshe, the author before his conversion, and Petrus, the author after his conversion, as you see here, as the speakers to explain and above all to justify his change of religion. Thus, in the third and last part of his book, Petrus explains at length the tenets of Christian doctrine and substantiates its veracity with exegetical and philosophical arguments, proving at the same time his great erudition. In the preceding first and second parts, it is Moshe, the Jew, who appears as the speaker and refutes the first theory and practice of Judaism and subsequently of Islam. And it's interesting to see that the chapter on Islam is by far the longest in his book. And the Jew, Moshe, is a representative of Islam, thus confirming a Christian stereotype that Islam and Judaism are more or less interchangeable religions, both proclaiming the same false beliefs. To underpin this, Moshe quotes in his chapter on Islam a lot of ayat in Latin translation, selected from no less than 25 surahs and translated from the Arabic text. Thanks to Moshe's translation from the Quran, rendered into Latin, for the first time, Christian readers in the Latin-speaking West, theologians and philosophers got access to at least some authentic passages of the Quran in their Latin language, selected, of course, for primarily polemical purposes. It took, however, another 4 decades, as you certainly are aware of. In the year 1143, Robert of Ketton and his colleagues, among them a certain Muhammad of Toledo, of disputed identity, translated the Quran into Latin in full. Again, without going into further details, it may suffice to recall here that in the Latin West, this translation very soon became the standard translation and the authoritative translation of the Quran into Latin, and was widely used despite other Latin Quran translations that followed, like those of Marco de Toledo, Juan de Segovia, and others. The canon Quran served not only as the proof text in the Western Christian theological argument with Islam down to the 17th, 18th century, but was translated in turn into Italian, into French, into Dutch, and into German within a very short period of time. As has long been seen, inter alia by Norman Daniel and Ludwig Hagemann, Ketton's Quran translation too follows the well-known medieval polemical approach and purpose, as it is already indicated in the Latin title, Lex Mahomet Pseudo Prophete, and so on and so on. But I don't want to go into detail, but here you have the same approach to the Quran as being somehow the holy book of Jews for Arabs. And this view is shared by Christian theologians in the West and in the East down to the 18th century, as you can see from this book. It is one of the famous Orthodox theologians of Russian, Ukrainian origin, and he is still widely used today. The Quran is a mixture, so to say, of Jewish and Arabic traditions. The translation Robert Ketton prepared with his colleagues was eventually published in a 3-volume edition in the 16th century by Theodor Bibliander in Basel. But the Quran translation was accompanied by a lot of tractates making up 3 thick volumes, tractates that contextualize the Quran within the Christian anti-Islamic polemics of the last centuries. And this edition of Bibliander's Quran is used for many centuries, down to the 19th century, as can be inferred from the mere fact that you find copies of it in various libraries in East and West Europe till today. A new chapter in the reception of the Quran started in the time of humanism and Reformation with its call back to the sources, back to the roots, ad fontes. But now, at various universities, chairs for Arabic and other Oriental languages were established, and the Quran was used by and large as a textbook for the study of Arabic language and literature because of the lack of other Arabic texts available. And to this contributed largely also the invention of book printing with movable characters at the end of the 15th century. And it is interesting to know that the first Arabic Quran printed on European soil came out of the press already in 1537 in Venice. A copy of this first printing you can still find in a monastery in Venice, where the printing press was located at that time. And it is said that this printing was made for Muslims in the Ottoman Empire, because, as you know, Sultan Bayezid II has banned the Arabic book printing in his Ottoman Empire. So Arabic books used in the Ottoman Empire were by and large printed outside the Ottoman Empire. So, but when you look into the Arabic text, that is the first surah of this Arabic printing, as you see in the monastery in Venice. When you look into the text, it contains so many print errors that it is hardly to believe that any Muslims would have read and used it. Since, as I said, the 16th century, at various universities, chairs for Oriental languages were established, and they were studying not only the Quran, but gradually also other Arabic and Islamic texts. But the Quran remained the textbook for the study of Arabic. And these studies were crowned with a number of translations that came into existence in the 17th, 18th century. I do not go into the details. And since I assume that you are familiar with the development in Western Europe, in Spain and France and England, I will now focus on the Eastern European scenery and have a look at the Quranic studies and translation made there. This chapter of reception of the Quran through translation is all the more interesting as from its very beginning it sees Christians and Muslims in close cooperation but also in competition. The chapter, the East European chapter of Quranic studies, is related to the spread of Islam into Eastern Europe in the wake of the migration movement of the Turkish tribes. Oh, sorry. If you would like to know a little bit more, there is a famous Tatar Muslim historian who has written more 100 years ago these 2 volumes on the history of this spread of Islam into Eastern Europe. His name is Murat Ramzi, sorry. This chapter of Quranic studies, as I said, is related to the spread of Islam into Eastern Europe, and Islam entered into Eastern Europe by a detour through Central Asia, And it was Tatar Muslims who, on their way to the West, adopted Islam, and spread Islam, disseminated them, and proclaimed the message of Islam in Eastern Europe since the High Middle Ages. And since the 13th, 14th century, they settled on the territory that once was the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, where Tatar Muslims lived as an integral part of its multi-ethnic and multi-religious and multicultural society since, as I said, the late 13th, early 14th century until today. Nowadays, they are scattered over 4 countries, that is Lithuania, Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine. And the second Tatar Muslim center, so to say, emerged in the Volga-Ural region with its spiritual and intellectual center, Kazan, nowadays the famous Islamic University in Kazan. This is, of course, not the time and place to deal at length with history and culture of these Tatar Muslims, but mention should be made of the fact that living in the neighborhood of different Christian, Jewish, Karaite, and Slavic pagan communities since the 16th century, these Tatar Muslims underwent a significant language change and gradually switched to the vernaculars. Though they did not give up their Kipchak, their original language, but continued to use it along with Ottoman Turkish, Arabic, and sometimes Persian as literary languages in everyday life. However, they adopted and used the local languages. In the southern part of this area, Belarusian, and in the northern part of this area, Polish. But as Muslims, they were writing these languages with Arabic script. They called it the script Arabica. Because of the just mentioned language change, as early as the mid-century, 16th century, Tatar Muslims began to translate the Quran into these vernaculars in the form of interlinear paraphrases in Belarusian or Polish called tafsiri, written between the lines of the Holy Book. No. Sorry. Oh. Yeah. This is a page from one of the earliest Muslim translations of the Quran into Polish. Interesting enough that apparently these early translations were made in response to Christian translation, because the first Polish scholar who is said to have rendered the Quran into Polish was Piotr Starkowiecki in the first half of the 17th century, second half of the 16th century, and the first half of the 17th, a famous interpreter of Oriental languages, including Ottoman, Turkish, Persian, and Arabic. Unfortunately, his Quran translation was never printed and is known today only from mentions by others. Tatar Muslims, in turn, did not practice book printing down to the 19th century. Thus, all their writings were transmitted in manuscripts, again and again copied by professional scribes, but mostly by non-professionals. Each and every family felt obliged to contribute to the preservation of this legacy. And when you are traveling through the Muslim villages today, in Belarus or Lithuania or Poland, you can find in any family house at least one manuscript collection. A second authored by Imam Uryash bin Ismail Shlomovich in Minsk, second translation of the Quran was completed at the end of the 17th century, but is still in manuscript. This text is published now 2 years ago in a 3-volume edition with a transliteration and commentary. Despite the fact that after the so-called partition of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealths in the last third of the 18th century, all Eastern Europe belonged to the Russian Empire, and despite all relations, Tatar Muslims living on the territory of the former Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had with their co-religionists in the Volga region and in the Islamic world, they maintained their religious tradition and customs and continued to use their Belarusian or Polish languages down today. Or the more surprising is that first complete Polish Quran translation and written with Arabic characters, not with Arabic characters, but in Latin script, was made only in the 19th century. And this was a revolution. A revolution because now the Quran was also made accessible to non-Muslim readers who were able to read, of course, the language in their Latin characters. And the more interesting is that this first Quran translation, written and printed in Latin characters, was the outcome of a cooperation of Christian theologians and Muslims, and was made perhaps in Vilnius or Novogrudek, nowadays in Belarus. The Christians participating in this translation were a Catholic priest, Dionysi Chlewinski, and the polymath Ignacy Domeyko, who in the 1830s emigrated via France to Latin America, where he became famous as researcher and founder of the University of Santiago de Chile. They did not know any word in Arabic, but they translated the Quran. And they used for their translation a French translation. They thought it is an authoritative translation because this was made by Claude Savary and printed according to the first printing with an impressum, claiming that this book was printed in Mecca in the year 1753. but this is a misprinting, so to say. The publication came out of the press only in 1783, and was widely spread and reprinted several times. And these Christian theologians used this French translation, even including the footnotes of Savary into their translation. When you compare the text, the French text and the Polish text, it is almost a literary translation, following even the layout of the model. This, however, to authorize this translation was attributed few years later, to a Muslim living in eastern Poland, and claimed that he was a real interpreter of the Quran, but this is not true. But nevertheless, till today, this Polish translation is still used, reprinted time and again. The last reprint came out in Nottingham a couple of years ago, still under the name of the Polish Muslim Buczacki, and the Quran is still quoted even in scholarly literature as the Buczacki Quran until now. Let's now switch to a more eastern part of Eastern Europe and look at the reception of and translation of the Quran among Tatar Muslims living in the Russian-speaking area. This subject is extensively dealt with by Efim Rezvan in his book, The Quran in Russia, accessible although in an Arabic version, Al-Quran Al-Karim fi Rusiya, that was published in Dubai in 2011. The first Russian Quran translation was produced in order to implement a decree of Tsar Peter I at the beginning of the 18th century. And it again was a translation based on a French translation of the Quran, the French translation made by Du Ruyer. It came out in Petersburg in 1716. Du Ruyer. And this is the first Russian translation. And this was made in Russian intentionally by the Tsar in order to give his Russian-speaking subject, the possibility to get access to the text. And this translation remained not the only one made in the 18th century, and again in cooperation with Christians and Muslims. Time does not allow to go into the details and speak about all the translations. At least 4 came out in the 18th century, followed by another 4 in the 19th century. But most of them were made from French texts and one only from George Sale's English translation of the Arabic Quran. That is interesting, all the more as even also by decree of the Tsar, this time of Tsarina the Great, the German-born Tsarina, who ordered the Arab printing, or the printing of the Quran in Arabic, in order to give the Muslims, in their Muslim subjects, their holy book in an Arabic print. And this came out at the end of the 18th century, printed in Petersburg, and the text was prepared by at that time, Imam of St. Petersburg. This is a copy of a page from this Quran edition. If you would like to have a look at, you can find a copy in Strasbourg in the university library. There, from this first printing, there are extant only 5 copies. One is in Strasbourg in the university library. And this is a copy, this photo is from the Strasbourg copy. This is all the more interesting as contrary to the printed Arabic printed Qurans in the West, here, the Quran is given a much more Muslim outlook, layout, because it's not just the text, but printed nicely, bibliographically, so to say, and surrounded in the margins by a commentary, by a tafsir, so as the Muslim Qurans are printed. And this tafsir was prepared by at that time, Imam of St. Petersburg, who at the same time, he was a calligrapher, at the same time, and he prepared the script, the typeset for printing of this Quran. And this typeset was used throughout the 19th century in Muslim printing in Imperial Russia, later on in Kazan. Again, time does not allow to go into further detail, but what is interesting, this Arabic text though printed by Christians. By the way, as a footnote, the publisher was a German who moved to Russia and opened a printing house for Oriental books in Petersburg. Karl Schnorr, his name. But this was accepted by the Muslims, interestingly enough, and this is due to the fact that it was the outcome of a cooperation of the Christian and the authorities and the Muslims and the Muslim community. And this Quran was used by the Muslims in the 19th century as the Quran edition. They used also in religious context and the holy book, basing their theological and other works on it. However, in response to this, Muslims were attempting to set up their own publishing house, and they did so at the beginning of the 19th century in Kazan, where they printed their own, with this typeset Quran edition in 1803, the so-called Kazan Basma in Tatar, or the Kalam al-Sharif, as they called the Quran. As they called the Quran. This is another reprint from the Kalam al-Sharif. And throughout the 19th century, more than 250,000 copies of the Quran were printed in Kazan and disseminated in the Muslim world. Interestingly, this Quran is different from the Quran that more than 100 years later was printed as a standard edition in Cairo, in Bulaq, in 1970 and 1922. Because in at least 20 surahs, you have not only different numbering of the verses, but also sometimes differences in the text. But despite these differences, this Quran translation is still used not only by the Tatar Muslims, but also in Central Asia in Muslim communities. And that's a very interesting phenomenon, that this Christian Muslim Quran production has its echo, so to say, till today. This would be an interesting topic to study, how this reception was, appreciated or not appreciated by those who came across to it. The Quran printings in Arabic paved the way to a new type of approach to its interpretation. And this is the next interesting chapter, and cooperation, so to say, indicated by the cooperation of, in this time, by Sunni Muslims, Shias, and Christians. Because the founder of this new approach to the Quranic studies was a Shi'i from Rasht in Persia, who came as a young man to Kazan and was a teacher at the University of Oriental Languages, because he mastered all the Islamic languages, the Tatar language, Kipchak, Persian, of course, Azerbaijan language, Azeri language, Arabic, Turkish, Kurdish, French, English, German, and even Biblical Hebrew. And together with his German colleague, Joseph Gottwald, who came from Germany in the 19th century as Orientalist to Kazan, they prepared the first concordance to the Quran and the first critical dictionary to the Quran. Not only to the Quran, but to the Mu'allaqat and the Diwan of Imru al-Qais as well. Together with his student, Girgas, these works were later on published and republished even in our days and still in use. This is a Quran concordance that was prepared by Kazim Bek and printed in Petersburg. The first comprehensive Quran concordance in Arabic this time. Followed by another one also made on the basis of the same text, and the dictionaries, the critical dictionaries, that were modeled or styled after the model of biblical dictionaries, Hebrew and Syriac and other biblical dictionaries known since the early modern times. So here a new approach to the Quranic studies was introduced, so to say, or can be observed, that is an approach that is more or less an adaptation of the model of Christian biblical scholarship, historical, philological, critical scholarship, as developed in the 19th century. And this was adopted by the Muslims in Eastern Europe, interestingly. And this is due to the fact that the Muslims in Eastern Europe were deeply influenced by the German and French Enlightenment. And due to their mostly German or French colleagues who came to Russia and disseminated the ideas of enlightenment among them. So they felt obliged, in order to be able to discourse with them, to adopt the methodologies Christians had developed and employed when dealing with the biblical text, and so they did something similar. And you can even find it in their attempt at using more or less Christian terminology in their Quran interpretation, and thus discussing not only similarities of what we have in common, but also trying to explain that our basic theological concept can be expressed in the same words. So we share certain basic convictions, basic conceptions, theological conceptions, and therefore we are allowed to use the same text. Again, I have to stop here at this point with look at the clock, but I would not stop without adding that in late 19th century and the early 20th century saw a next interesting chapter of Christian-Muslim Quran translation and interpretation, and this is closely related to the cooperation of a famous Orthodox theologian, Georgy Zablukov, and his Muslim colleagues in Kazan at the university. Zablukov grew up in a Muslim environment. He was familiar with the Muslim languages from his early youth. He spoke Tatar and Persian and Arabic and Turkish, and he had prepared a Russian translation of the Quran, which still today is regarded as one of in terms of philology, the best interpretations of the Quran we have. And in addition to that, he wrote a number of books dealing with the theological issues of the Quran and studying and discussing these issues in the context of relevant Christian traditions. One of his very most interesting books is his 1,000 pages interpretation of the 99 good names of God. So, and he tried to explain the nature of the Muslim interpretation in the Christian context, or the context of Christian theological tradition. Not long ago, 2 years ago, a Muslim theologian, Tawfiq Ibrahim, in Moscow, he wrote an answer, a response to Zablukov's interpretation of the names of God, and compiled also a 1,000-page book on the 99 good names of God. So here we have a different approach to the Quran that should be discovered, I think, because it shows quite a number of examples, not to imitate, but can be used as something to learn from. And that something could be learned from can be seen also in the changing scenery of the reception of the Quran in Europe today. As you know, the scenery in the European Quranic studies changed in recent decades significantly. And this is due not only to new developments in the Oriental studies in general, but in particular by the establishment of Islamic theological centers in Germany and in other countries. You heard about already that. And it is still in question that cannot be opened yet. What will be the outcome of this new way of Quranic studies, new way of interpreting, translating the Quran into modern European languages in East and West, again made by Muslims and Christians alike. And let me conclude drawing your attention to a project that we have at our university in Tübingen at the Center of Islamic Theology that is drawing on this tradition of Christian-Muslim joint venture, so to say, in Quranic translation and interpretation. You know that since Middle Ages, many Muslims have written commentaries on the Gospels, on the Hebrew Bible as well. In every century, there were Muslims doing this. And referring to this tradition, this project now starts to bring together these traditional Muslim interpretations of the Christian Bible, the Jewish Bible, and the Christian interpretation of the Quran. So a new way, under the title of scriptural reasoning, is opened to study the Quran jointly. Christians and Muslims and Jews, in our case in Tübingen, alike are studying the Quran, trying to understand its value and contributing to the proclaiming of its ethical and theological message that had a great impact on the development of the intellectual scenery of Europe for many centuries and is to be rediscovered in our days even more than yesterday's. Thank you very much for your attention.